Audio on demand from Vision Christian Media.
Coming up today on The Story.
There were spies in the church. If you said something to someone that could be deemed as being negative or questioning, it would go back to the pastor. And you would either get a talk aimed at you, or people in the church would shun you. People who used to say hello to you would not say hello to you anymore. And if you're really bad, you get a visit from the oversight.
The Story.
G'day, I'm Jimmy Colfax. Welcome to The Story. Well, Sophie Bowden was in a cult-like church for many years and was deceived for a long time. Then she finally learned about the freeing truth of salvation, that we are saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ and nothing else. Today, we'll hear how Sophie was set free from the bondages of a cult-like church, and we'll hear the role Christian radio played in deprogramming her from false doctrines and then filling her with life-giving biblical truth. All that and more is coming up as Sophie shares her inspiring story. Sophie's chatting with Eric Scatterbo from her home in Tasmania.
Welcome to the program, Sophie Bowden.
Oh, thanks, Eric.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us today. And what were some of the negative things that came about from being in this cult-like church for so many years?
I had a distorted view of God. I thought God was an ogre. I thought God was just waiting for me to make mistakes so that he could smite me. I thought every problem I had or every tribulation I had was God punishing me.
Wow.
It also gave me an unhealthy relationship, of course, with God, also an unhealthy relationship with myself because I didn't think God loved me. So I had a very low self-esteem, and I had a very unhealthy relationship with the people around me as well because I hated people, especially men.
You hated people?
I certainly did.
And men, especially?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that's correct. Sorry about that, but that is correct.
Okay, I won't take it personally, but this is in the past, of course. But
yes,
that tells, that tells us where you were at. And unfortunately, you're not alone. There are many people who are or have been in cult-like churches that have left them with a distorted view of who God is and relationships with other people as well. So we want to hear your story and how the Lord set you free. So let's start at the very beginning. Where were you born and raised?
Sure. Well, my parents and my two older siblings, they immigrated to Australia in 1967 as 10-pound Poms, and I was born in 1968 in country Victoria. I was in a non-Christian home and we were really quite isolated. We didn't have any family. We didn't have any aunts or uncles or nieces, nephews or anything like that. My mum didn't have a car and so we weren't able to go out or do anything like that. So I had to do a lot of my schooling by distance education, or we called it correspondence in those days. So that's where we had work sent to us, assignments sent to us in the mail. We do the work and it would get sent back to the school for assessment.
So this is kind of a theme in your early life of being isolated and, lacking the warmth of family and relatives.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I remember as a kid, I might hear the word niece or nephew or cousin and I think, well, who are they? Because I just had no idea. Obviously I had them, but I didn't know them, sort of thing. And in a way, it was kind of idyllic childhood where, I'd get all my work done by 11 o'clock in the morning and I'd have the rest of the day to myself. I would, go bushwalking, reading, watching TV, whatever. But the problem with our family really was with my dad, and he was never home. He would be out and about 7 days a week from early in the morning till late at night. But when he was home, he was very abusive towards my mother. Now, I want to point out here that he wasn't...
was it verbal abuse? Let's just be clear.
Yes, absolute verbal abuse. Yeah,
okay,
it was definitely verbal abuse. And we were isolated. My mum had no friends. She had no family. But this was our one connection with the world, with the outside world, and it was my dad. And even though my mum didn't suffer from physical bruising, she had internal bruising from my dad. And to a certain extent, I think we all did. And I remember my mum saying to me once that we fight in front of you so that you know what marriage is like.
What impact did her saying that have on you?
Well, from that age, I thought I'm never going to get married.
Oh,
that's for sure.
okay.
If that's what marriage is like, who the heck wants something like that? Why do I want to be controlled and abused by a man?
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, he's not answerable to anyone.
Yeah. Now, what I'm hearing from you is that you were pretty much a prime candidate for a possible cult because they would supply to you the things that you're lacking: family, warmth, all of that.
Yes.
So let's continue. But getting back to your father, this is another theme in your life is bad relationships with men, would you say?
Yes, absolutely.
Or a negative attitude toward men? Or how would you characterize it?
I think at the time when I was a kid, I don't think I had a negative idea about men. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, look, I didn't know any different. Yeah. But it wasn't until I went to the cult-type church and I saw how men were behaving there as well that I really thought this just is not right. And not all men were like that. There were some really lovely men who treated their wives really well. But the leadership and those who weren't kind to their wives, it really stood out and it had an impact, and it was a big trigger for me.
Okay. Now, in the midst of all that, you said, if you are really there, God, show me where you are or who you are. Is that right?
Yes. Yes. One of the things I used to love doing was I would go bushwalking. And I was just like, oh, you've got all this nature around you. The Australian bush is just absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
There had to be some creator and it had to be some sort of God. And I remember one time walking in the bush and just saying, look, I don't know what's going to happen in my life. There's got to be more to life than what I've had so far. If you really are there, God, then prove yourself to me. Show me where you are. And years later, he did.
Okay, so then moving into high school, then what happened?
Yeah, well, circumstances changed and I was able to go to high school for the last 3 years. So I went to high school in 1984 and that was quite a shock. I was definitely the nerd and the odd one out. I spoke perfect Queen's English and everyone else spoke Australian and used Australian slang and all
you didn't know any of that, huh?
No, I had no idea. And I was a complete nerd when it came to fashion and all this sort of stuff.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, totally green. But I was so grateful. There were 3 lovely girls who befriended me and my circle of friends got bigger and, I had a good circle of friends that were just really, really lovely and really kind. And one of those friends was a male friend and he sort of aimed for me and was telling me about his church, telling me about miracles. I had lots of questions. He was able to answer these questions and he was very different from the other boys in high school. He was really sincere and he was really gentle. And I found out years later that, well, he wanted to save my soul, but he also wanted to go out with me as well. So he had two reasons as to why he wanted me to bring me to church. So, look, I thought, I'll go along to church. And this was a big thing for me because I'd only been in the city, like in Melbourne, maybe once or twice sort of thing. So his brother picked me up and we went to this huge church of about 1,000 people in Melbourne. Very overwhelming. But I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with this church. I had aunts and uncles. I had brothers and sisters. A church of 1,000 people. So there were a couple of hundred young people. And the preaching was very charismatic. It was just so passionate. There were testimonies. The church we used to have like 2 meetings on a Sunday, 2 meetings during the week, and youngies on a Saturday night. And I went to everything.
Oh, you just couldn't get enough.
Never missed a meeting. I just couldn't get enough. No, absolutely correct.
Yeah, and of course, this is kind of filling your love need, the vacuum that you had in your life.
Exactly. And I want to point out here, because this is something I struggled with later on in my life, stupid people or dumb people don't join cults. It's people that have a need. It's the people who are searching, and a cult will fill that need or tell you what you need to hear or what you want to hear. And so I got baptised by full immersion on March the 24th, 1985, in front of 1,000 people. Had spotlights in my eyes, couldn't see a thing, but it didn't matter. But I came up out of the water and had a wonderful experience with God, and I knew God did show me where he was. I knew that I had a wonderful experience with God, and I knew I was now a member of the church, and it was a wonderful feeling.
So the love and affection they were showing to you, did you sense it was real, or do you think it was fake?
Yes. Well, I had nothing else to compare it to. But yes, I felt it was very real because they were so passionate. And people would say, oh, what's your name? How long have you been coming along? And what's your story? Where do you live? And all this sort of stuff. And I was just embraced, engulfed in this church, and especially with the young people. I mean, as a child, I never had the opportunity to go out with friends. I had no friends. We didn't go out for coffee, didn't go to the movies, didn't go, I don't know what we had then in the 80s, discos or whatever. But we never had that sort of opportunity. But church provided me with an avenue for music. I was involved in lots of activities in the church. And, the other thing is after meetings on a Sunday, it's like meetings would finish about 6 o'clock, and then there'd always be someone's house that they'd have a supper, and everyone's invited. I would go on a supper course.
So there was your whole social life all accounted for.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. So we'd go from one house for a supper, another house for a supper, another supper. We'd drive an hour somewhere in Melbourne.
Yeah.
I was having to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Wow.
So, it was just a dream, and it was just absolutely magnificent. I was having a great time.
So at this point, you're thinking, this is just too good to be true. This is everything I was looking for.
This is everything I was looking for, absolutely. I found out there were problems in the church that I saw, but they didn't affect me, and they were far way off. If you've got a church of 1,000 people and there's a problem over there, well, you just avoid it, and I believed everything that I was told. And it wasn't until years later that I realised how bad the abuse was and how it affected people. But it didn't affect me, and I just didn't see it. I was blinded to it.
You're listening to The Story. Today, Eric Scatterbo is chatting with Sophie Bowden, who was in a cult-like church for many years and was deceived for a very long time. Next, we'll hear more of Sophie's story and some of the characteristics of cults and cult-like churches. All that and more when we return.
The Story. If this program has highlighted something you'd like prayer for, we'd love to pray for you. Call 1-800-PRAY-FOR-ME. That's 1-800-772-936. It's a free call. Or text 0401 132 888.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Colfax, and this is The Story. We're back with more of Eric Scatterbo chatting with Sophie Bowden, who was in a cult-like church for many years and was deceived for a long time. Before the break, we heard how Sophie's church initially seemed too good to be true. They were affectionate and kind, and she felt like she had finally found the loving family she had longed for her whole life. However, as time went on, cracks began to appear in the facade, and she slowly became more and more aware that things weren't quite what they seemed at first. Next, we'll hear more of the characteristics of cults and cult-like churches as Sophie continues her chat with Eric Scatterbo.
Now, at this point, we want to emphasize that this was not officially a cult, but it was a cult-like church.
Absolutely, yes. I had never heard the word cult at that stage, but that's correct.
Okay, and so some characteristics of a cult. In a Christian context, the definition of a cult is specifically a religious group that denies one or more of the fundamentals of biblical truth. Or to put it another way, a cult is an organized group with religious beliefs that are off theologically and differ significantly from Orthodox Christianity. And specifically in your case, what they did was they added to the requirements for salvation. So, for example, Orthodox Christianity views salvation as believing in Jesus, which is best summed up in the biblical verse, John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him, whoever believes in Jesus, shall not perish but have eternal life." That's what Orthodox Christianity believes. Cults add to that. Cults or cult-like churches tend to add other conditions. They say you're not saved unless you, for example, unless you are baptized or you speak in tongues or unless you attend their church and do their rules or some other conditions. However, even though these things sometimes can be good in themselves, like getting baptized or going to church are good things in and of themselves, they're not required for salvation. But that's what they were saying. So I just want to emphasize that very, very strongly. Salvation comes through belief in Jesus Christ. And anybody or any church that adds to that is adding to salvation, and it's wrong and it's unhealthy. So that's more or less what you found yourself in that situation where you were in a church that was saying, believe in Jesus, but you also need to do X, Y, and Z in order to have salvation. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct, because they put church doctrine or church, they called it guidelines, but anyway, they were mandatory. They put church doctrine as high as God's word, and they would add to it. And Revelation warns us about adding and subtracting from the word of God.
Yep.
You had to be totally loyal to the leaders and the oversight, and you weren't allowed to question their authority. And I'll give you an example here.
Okay.
We never had an AGM.
An annual general meeting.
Yeah, we never had an AGM. And you've got to think that when you've got a church of 1,000 people, and there's churches Australia-wide and in New Guinea and that sort of thing, I mean, there's a lot of income coming into the church. We never had an AGM. We had no idea. So there was no...
no financial accountability.
No, absolutely not whatsoever. And and I know of a couple of people who questioned that and said, look, you're getting all this money, where's the money going to?
Yeah.
And they were basically told to mind their own business, and several things would either happen. You would be shunned by people in the church if you kept causing trouble. You were shunned by people in the church. If you had any sort of ministry role in the church, that would be taken off you, and you would be a marked person. And if you continued, you would be kicked out. And people in the church, if they asked after, where is so-and-so, look, they're not a member of the church anymore. They had a very bad attitude.
So this is one of the characteristics of a cult-like church and cults as well. Cults and cult-like churches tend to dominate cult members or church members through psychological manipulation and pressure strategies. And that sounds like exactly what you're describing. They're kind of manipulating people and shunning people if they don't do what the church wants them to do and all that. Yeah. And we should also add that one of the things they added to salvation was church attendance. So they were saying to you, if you didn't go to church and do all the things we're telling you to do, you're going to lose your salvation.
Absolutely. And I didn't have a problem with that because I was going to everything anyway.
Oh, okay.
But that became very, very obvious when I came to Tasmania. But I just want to tell another story. I'll tell you about what happened when I was in Melbourne. I knew a lady who was a very beautiful young lady, and she got married to, a young man. And she ended up going to oversight after a couple of years of marriage and said, my husband is beating me up. And she was told, you need to do more to please your husband. So the onus was put on her, and she ended up leaving, and she took her family with her. Yeah, absolutely.
And then the family was shunned?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes, they would have been.
I mean, anybody who leaves.
Anyone who leaves is shunned. Bad things are said about people, and you're given a terrible story. You're given, this person was causing trouble. This person was never really a member of the church. And bad things were said about good people, people who had discernment, people who had legitimate claims about the church. Bad things were said about them. And you had no way of checking what the church was saying, because you weren't allowed to. When someone left the church, it doesn't matter if you're related to them, if you're friends with them, you weren't allowed to contact them. If you saw them in the street, you had to shun them. If they tried to contact you, you weren't allowed to have any sort of conversation with them. And I remember in Tasmania, a friend of mine left the church, And I was so scared of even ringing her in case the church found out. I was actually in fear.
So this is the depth of the cult-like feelings you had. And I just wanted to back up and say, if you are in a marriage where you are being beaten, do not follow the advice that that lady that you talked about was given. Get some help.
Yes.
Get some help and get yourself into a safe place. And obviously you want to try to restore the marriage, but not while you're there being abused.
Yes, that absolutely.
I just want to make that abundantly clear.
Yeah.
We completely reject that type of advice that was given.
Yes. And the other thing too is 9 out of 10 times, if there's a problem in a marriage, it's the woman who's at fault.
Well, that's what they were saying.
The man could be, even other things like there's financial abuse, or the husband is neglecting his family, or that sort of thing. 9 out of 10 times the woman would get blamed for it.
Okay, so this goes back to the initial thing we talked about, that you had a growing dislike for men, and this is kind of feeding into that.
It started to grow, yes. Absolutely. Yeah. It came into full fruition when I was in Tasmania,
Okay, so before we continue your story, I just wanted to list some of the characteristics, some of the red flags, so to speak, to look for in a cult-like unhealthy church. So we mentioned already that unhealthy cult-like churches add to salvation. That's very common. And they use psychological manipulation and pressure strategies like shunning, like you've mentioned. Also, cults are usually headed by a powerful leader who isolates members from the rest of society. So was there like a charismatic leader in this church that you were going to?
Absolutely. Definitely, because
who could not be questioned, because he's the Lord's anointed, and you cannot question this messianic type person.
Absolutely correct. And this was an independent church. So were there no checks and balances in place?
Oh, no accountability, no oversight.
No accountability. He was surrounded by other men, but they were yes men. And I remember one time we had this beautiful pastor who moved over from New Zealand, and he became a pastor in the church. And he was shocked by how people were treated. And he spoke to the head pastor about that, and he was shunned. He lost his pastoral position, and he was kicked out of the church.
Wow. So another main characteristic of an unhealthy cult-like church. Another characteristic, which you have already kind of brought up already, is that cults have exclusivity. That is, we are the only ones who are correct in our theology, and we shouldn't associate with other people outside of our church or group because they're all wrong. So is that kind of the attitude they had?
Absolutely, and they were bad influences as well.
So that's what you were told. Don't associate with anybody else. We're the right ones. We're the only right ones. Everybody else is wrong, and they're evil. Yes,
absolutely correct. We were never encouraged to have anything to do with other churches or other Christians. If you thought, oh, look, I might go to this other church, you wouldn't have been allowed. You would have been in serious problems.
Oh, okay.
You weren't allowed to have friends in the world or anything like that because they would drag you down. And you were very much isolated, and you had a fear. You had a fear of people that, and like the pastor used to bag other churches, even from the platform. And there was really no such thing as worldwide ministries. The only ministry that was worthwhile, the only ministry where you could be saved at, was this particular church that I was going at. And you believed it. Absolutely believed it. Hook, line and sinker.
Everybody else is wrong. We're the only ones that are right.
Absolutely correct.
Okay, so some of the other characteristics of a cult-like church: absolute authoritarianism, which kind of you're describing; also no accountability, which you also are describing; zero tolerance for criticism or questioning. Like in a healthy church, you can always ask questions. In an unhealthy church, don't ask questions or you'll be shunned.
Absolutely. I remember after we'd moved to Tassie, my husband and I moved to Tassie in 1990, and we attended a smaller version of the church. It was about 60 people. And I remember the head pastor came to give a talk one time, and he was very angry giving the talk. And he said to us from the platform, he said, if you're told to do something, You just shut up and you do as you're told.
Without questioning or anything.
No, oh my goodness, no, absolutely not. And there were spies in the church. If you said something to someone that could be deemed as being negative or questioning, it would go back to the pastor.
Oh.
And you would either get a talk aimed at you, or people in the church would shun you. People who used to say hello to you would not say hello to you anymore. And if you're really bad, you get a visit from the oversight. The other thing too is that you're spied on. You have no private life. They want to know everything about what's going on in your life.
Well, that was part one of Eric Scadabow's conversation with Sophie Bowden, who discovered that the church she was attending had many cult-like characteristics. We'll hear how Sophie finally reaches the breaking point and decides to leave the church next time. Also, we'll hear the role Christian radio played in deprogramming her from false doctrines and then filling her up with life-giving biblical truth. That's all coming up next time. Meanwhile, if you'd like to learn more about the characteristics of an unhealthy cult-like church, a good resource is the book The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse by David Johnson and Jeff Van Vonderen. The subtitle of the book is Recognizing and Escaping Spiritual Manipulation and False Spiritual Authority Within the Church. Finally, if you can identify with any of the struggles that Sophie has gone through and need someone to talk to and pray with, our prayer line is 1-800-PRAY-FOR-ME. That's 1-800-772-936. A member of our prayer team is standing by and would love to chat and pray with you. On that number again, 1-800-772-936. Well, until next time, when we'll hear how Sophie is finally set free from the bondages of a cult-like church, I'm Jimmy Colfax, encouraging you to share your story with someone today.
Next time on The Story.
I went out one day and I went past a Christian bookshop, and I never knew that there were Christian bookshops. So I went in, I picked up this daily devotional, which I had never seen a daily devotional before. So I went home, read this devotional and just devoured it. And the gentleman who wrote the devotional used to read the devotional out on a Christian radio station that I tuned into.
Sophie Bowden was in a cult-like church for many years and was deceived for a long time. That was until she finally reached her breaking point and decided to leave the unhealthy church. We'll hear the role Christian radio played in deprogramming her as Sophie shares more of her story next time.
The Story. Just another way Vision is helping you look to God daily.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.